Just tell me when.
Yeah, you can start now.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, as usual, depending on where you are. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets. Today, we're going to talk about Britain's supposed potential, maybe, exit from the European Union, which would be a tremendous change and shock for the European Union and the European project. Britain has always had its own relationship to the continent, blessed, if it will, by the Channel, which separates it from the land armies of Europe. It's impossible, really, to talk about. Britain is taking a chance. Mr. Cameron is taking a chance. But in a democracy, I suppose there's very little choice on proposing that this referendum, that the people have the final word, the people of Britain have the final word on whether or not they should stay within the European Union. There is an almost universal approval for staying within the Union by what are unfortunately called these days the elites. As a shorthand term, I'm going to use it. By the way, anyone who has any comments or questions or anything, please type them into chat. I have it up here as well, so we can take a look at it. And I always like to have people participate if they can or are willing to in the webinar. So in order to really appreciate what's going on, I've read an interesting column by Gideon Rachman, who is a very well-known and well-respected columnist for the FT, the Financial Times in London. And he compared the populist sentiment around the question of whether Britain should stay in the European Union, the referendum, to some of the popular interest in Donald Trump's candidacy in the United States. Now, I don't want to draw too heavily on this comparison, but the point is that there are large swaths of the population that do not go along with the opinions of the opinion makers, the columnists, the TV people, the politicians. In the United States, just so I'm not talking about Mr. Trump's politics, but as a political leader, which he has turned out to be, he recognized, and no one else did, that there is a large group of people in the Republican Party, but elsewhere as well, who do not feel at all represented by the candidates and the major parties. The comparison that Mr. Rachman is making is that this is quite possibly true in Britain as well. Without, and I admire him for this in his writing, without passing judgment on the qualities or the reasons, there is a serious argument to be made for leaving the European Union. There is a serious argument to be made for staying. But before we address the arguments, and then we'll of course have to look at, and you are looking at on your screen, let me just tell you what this is, since you're going to be staring at it for a little bit. The white line is the FTSE 100. The green line is the Dow, and you can see the Dow has had a much stronger rally from the bottom than the FTSE has. And the yellow is the sterling. There's a much greater congruence, of course, between the sterling and the FTSE than there is involving the Dow. The origin of the EU is, and I've written on this a number of times over the years and spoken about it a number of times. The European Union is essentially a political entity. It was founded to avoid the horrendous history of the first half of the 20th century in Europe. And you could easily say that that goes back as far as you would like, since the Europeans have been warring with each other, but then so has everyone else for time immemorial. But at least to avoid the horrendous consequences of nationalism in the first 50 years, the first 45 years of the 20th century. Of course, we're talking about World War I or World War II. It's founded in the Coal and Steel Pact between Britain and France in, I believe, 1950. It moved on to all the various iterations, ever increasing union, as their phrase is, to the common market, to the EU, and then to the Maastricht Treaty. The goal of this organization from the very beginning, although not necessarily stated, and rarely sought approval by the people of the continent and the various nations, was a political union, was the equivalent of the United States with the federal system, the federal capital in Brussels, the nationals, much as Marx used to say that what did he say? The economic system, nations will wither away under the aegis of the advanced communist system. That was sort of the idea, and I'm not making a complete equivalence here, but that was sort of the idea of what would happen in Europe. It was more a vision, you might say a fantasy, than anything else. But it was very much an idea of a political union to avoid past horrors. Here in the United States, it's very hard to imagine the type of impact that the two world wars would have had in Europe. We were late to the first, and although we participated fully in the second, we did not have our country devastated. We did not lose anything like the number of soldiers and civilians that the European countries experienced. So it is hard for an American, and I speak as an American in this case, to understand the political, economic, and cultural trauma of those two world wars in the European nations. That said, the European project has always been a project of the rulers, democratically elected perhaps, but nonetheless the rulers. It has rarely been sent to a referendum, as the euro has rarely been sent to a referendum. And it, which I think has been a profound mistake for the Europeans seeking this unity. Of course, what you are putting in conflict are national identities, but not just national identities. The nation state is, and has proven historically, the largest entity that seems to be able to gather the loyalty of its people. The wider political groupings that have existed in history are imperial. And given the differences in time and culture, they have not sustained themselves. The European colonial empires were founded on conquest primarily. So was the Ottoman Empire primarily, as was the Roman and the Persian and any number of others that you want to note. And what has happened is as the empires fell away and the force behind them withered, you end up back to it with a cultural, national identity. Iran is Iran now, Persia in the past is an excellent example of this. As the empires and the religions behind them waxed and waned over the centuries, the core of Iran, of Persia, and the Persian culture has remained the same. So the nation state, although it is not coincident always with a cultural entity, is most strong when it is. And so this is the problem that the European Union and the visionaries who tried to create this federal states of Europe after the Second World War have encountered. The common market, which created a largely continent-wide trading union, has been remarkably successful, I would say. The benefits of that type of economic union are evident to all, and they do not really gather any difficulty or create any difficulty for the people within those borders. That had been true to the most greatest degree, but not the complete degree. Hold on, let me check here. Okay, having to with the free travel within the European Union as well. Although, of course, once poor nations began to join the European Union, the free travel throughout the EU permitted them to attempt to emigrate or at least move to other countries to look for work. Part of that has created issues within the European Union, but by and large, that had been a successful economic union. Britain did not join this in the beginning. It joined in 73. It was passed by a referendum in 75, if I remember, which had about 67% approving membership in the common market, as it was called then. Times, unfortunately, have changed a bit. The biggest problem was not actually, at least not the initial problem, it may be more emotional, and that is the problem of emigration into the EU recently. Because the way the EU's free borders work, once you're inside the EU, you are allowed to go anywhere within that political grouping. And that has become an enormous problem with the immigrants, the refugees from the countries of the Middle East. Some of them fleeing, many of them fleeing war and disaster, and many of them seeking a better life. The United States has a long history in comparison of this type of immigration. Almost all of us here are descendants of immigrants to this country. The culture is the culture of the United States. It tends to subsume the individual cultures of the people who come. After all, I'm Italian on much sides of my family, but I consider myself, and my father was an immigrant, and I consider myself an American. It's not even a question for us here. It's a little, I think it's a little harder for Europeans. I'm not passing judgment on it, but it does make for a difference. So once the European Union was up and functioning, it provided excellent economic benefits, I think, for many of the peoples within the Union. Things became more difficult, and you know where I'm going with this, of course, with the euro. This cuts two ways for the British. One, they can look at the turmoil and the problems that have been created by the European adoption of a single currency, single interest rate policy, where the policy is basically performs the needs of the largest countries and not the smaller countries. Looking at that setup and the difficulty that that has created for many countries in Europe, the British can be thankful that they elected not to join the euro. I think it's also true that the travails of the Europeans with the united currency, with the euro, will probably serve as a serious impediment to anyone else joining there. You notice that you have not seen, in the years leading up to 2008, you would hear a good deal of talk about whether or not the Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, and Romania, and others who had joined the European Union, how they were progressing along the path to eventual membership in the euro, whether their inflation rates and growth rates and other regulatory regimens were coinciding, were growing towards the European norm. There hasn't been a peep of that since the financial crash in 2008. I think it is evident both to people inside and outside the European Union, and certainly to the national governments of Poland and Hungary and Romania and the other countries that did not join from Eastern Europe, did not join the euro, that it is very beneficial to your economic growth and to your sovereignty to maintain your own currency. So my guess is it will be a long time before we see any other of the major European, Eastern European economies joining the euro. Okay, so this brings us back. Let's go back to the British and to try and tease out where it is that the British, or what they're looking at when it comes to whether or not, let's put it this way, whether or not the economic factors are more important, if we can make this judgment, than some of the other factors, shall we say, the cultural factors, if we'd like to put it that way. The factors of sovereignty is an easier way to put it, of who's making the rules for the British. Is it Parliament in London? Is it the British bureaucracy, the British civil service? Or is it the civil service and the bureaucracy and the European Parliament in Brussels? So one way to start with that is to take a look at the economic differences between the countries. And let's just start with the PMIs. Okay, this is manufacturing PMI. This is market. Market has only been running since about 2012. It's a British firm tracking the purchasing managers' indexes on the continent and in the UK. You can see that from about 2012 on, the UK was considerably in advance of what it was happening in the EMU. And since then, they've more or less coalesced as to where they are, where the outlooks are in both countries. Okay, that's marketing. Now let's look at services. Services will give you a similar view. There isn't a great deal. Now there is, in this particular type of survey, a 59 number as opposed to a 54 number is a pretty significant difference. But these are also sentiment numbers. So they are telling you that through this period here from 2012 on, the British economy was performing better than the EU economy. But again, these are sentiment numbers. Let's take a look at some harder numbers here. Okay, this is retail sales. I'm going to get to the larger ones in the end. Retail sales from the same, this goes back, these are older numbers that go back a little further. Again, there's differences, but there you can certainly see the coincidence, the correlation between the numbers, as you would expect. And there isn't, although there is difference, it is a relatively, in fact, as the time goes on, the differences have lessened somewhat between the two on the retail sales go. But there isn't a great divergence, meaning that things aren't starting to go in one direction for the EU and another direction for Britain. Okay, so those are retail sales. Next, we will look at industrial production. Same type of story. The interesting thing about these numbers is not the absolute difference between the continent and the island, but in their intertwining. It's clear from these numbers and from the way they rise and fall with each other that the economies are very closely tied. Just based on that, you can be certain that the attempt to extricate, this is what the voters decide, Britain from the EU is going to be difficult, costly, and costly to the economy. Now, it is quite possible that the electorate, not understanding, and when understanding, I don't mean they don't understand that the factors that are involved here. That I disagree with. But I don't think that anybody really understands, no matter what they say, of course. And almost every utterance, newspaper article, speech, comment from politicians and others in Britain about this topic is going to be colored by, of course, what side they're on. There aren't going to be that many dispassionate viewers of this. Mr. Rockman, I thought, did a very good job of it in the FT. But a lot of this is unknown. I mean, the British have been part of the EU for now more than 40 years. That's a lot of regulation, a lot of ruling, a lot of doing business in a particular way. It's also true that if Britain wants to remain part, wants to keep, even if they withdraw, wants to retain access to the European Union and its markets, which I'm sure they will, then they will have to do at least certain things the way the EU wants. And since the entire EU establishment is not going to be very pleased if Britain ups and votes to leave, you can be sure that the terms of access will be strict, if not onerous. But all of that is in the future. So what we can see from these charts, let's look at another one. Okay, let's look at, this is Consumer Price Index. Again, the congruence of the charts is remarkable. Not the fact that it is, but of course, the actual degree of it. Part of this difference, one of the things that I find interesting about the difference between the EU economy and the British economy, it's one of degree, but it is typified in a chart like this. The British economy is general. Oops, this chart is not up there. I just saw that now. Sorry, folks. I just saw that that chart is up there now. Sorry about that, folks. But the British economy is more dynamic in general. It is more along the lines of the United States economy. It is less devoted to bureaucracy. Now, we're all devoted to bureaucracy. God knows we're all devoted to regulation everywhere. It's part of the modern culture. But I heard an interesting, Office Depot is attempting to merge with Staples here in the United States. And it is being blocked, can be blocked by the Federal Trade Commission. This is a history of going back to I know it's actually the Federal Trade Commission, but it goes back to the antitrust campaigns of the early part of the 20th century, where there were legitimate monopolies that could control markets. However, they tended not to, meaning that they tended to obtain that control by reducing their prices. But leave that alone. So the briefs, they're starting to hear this in court because, of course, it's being opposed in the courts by the companies. Now, what is happening to retail big box stores? They're, of course, being smothered by competition from the web. If you need to buy a generic product like a ream of paper, then you can buy it as easily from the web as you can by getting in your car and going down to local Staples or Office Depot and buying it. And that's what people are doing, larger and larger percentages of them. And other companies have a jump. They have a better web presence, I assume. I don't know this, I'm assuming, for Staples and Office Depot. So Office Depot and Staples are trying to merge. And the government case against them is based on the fact that there are liable to be they're alleging that there will be higher prices for some of the customers of these two companies. Aside from whether or not that is true, it shows a misappreciation, shall we say, of what's driving business costs. The reason Staples and Office Depot are trying to merge is because their businesses are under pressure from web businesses. And the idea that in a commodity business, basically, I don't mean commodities as in gold or oil, but in a commoditized business, there's nothing particularly special about a ream of paper, no matter where you get it. It's a commodity, basically. You'll go for the lowest price, the best delivery, that's it. In that kind of environment, the pricing pressures on the companies are enormous. There is no ability really to raise prices. This is an economy-wide and a 15 and 20-year trend now in pricing. It's why there's so little pressure, among other reasons, why there's so little pressure on wages. So the regulatory issue, as evidenced by the FTC, in my opinion, not understanding what the pressures really are on a company, is emblematic of some of the fears that Britain and British people and business leaders as well, I assume, may have on the regulatory state emanating from Brussels. So the economic side of that entire argument is that the traditionally freer, less regulatory, less centralized regulatory regimen out of Britain, much more like, as the Continentals call it, the Anglo-Saxon model, referring specifically to the United States and Britain, which they view as a less fettered system. Well, that's how I would view it, as a less fettered system. They would probably view it as a less fair system. Hard to say what exactly they would say, but anyway, one which is not really as well regulated, as properly regulated, if you will, by central authorities, is one which will spill over, and which the British have seen. Now, there have been a lot of stories in Britain about silly regulations on all sorts of things, cheeses and the size of fruits and stuff like that. I don't think those are the heart of what the issue is. They certainly play well in the press and in the media and the British tabloids. But there is a real issue as to who is deciding how the British industries function. And there isn't necessarily a right way on this. I don't believe that there is. Or at least what I believe is based in, and as serves many people everywhere else, is based in part of your views that come to you down through your culture and what you believe is most effective, most greatest good, whatever standard you'd like to make the greatest good for a number of people, whatever you'd like to judge it. There are different ways of doing these things, and some of this is based in culture. So the British view of business is considerably different than the continental view. So is their political history. So is their cultural history. So the realistic point that a British exit from the EU will be costly is not one I think that anyone denies. In order to justify it simply from an economic functionality point of view, if that were the case, if that were the only issue that the British electorate is going to look at, my guess is that the inherent conservatism of most people when it comes to changing an enormous fact of their own life, and with the self-evident difficulty and costliness that it's going to be, would probably tilt the discussion and the vote to stay in the EU. However, as we know, I'm not sure, I am sure, well, let me put it another way. That is not the only issue. And the other issues, because you can make an argument that over time, and I don't live in Britain. I'm not a subject of the Queen. So my personal experience with the differences perhaps and the impositions, if you will, of the European regulatory state on Britain are minimal. And I don't know if from an experiential point of view, what you've actually experienced, what you see in the stores, whether or not there is that great of an infringement upon the British way of conducting business emanating from Brussels, because the EU regulations are supposed to be obeyed by everyone within the EU. And I am sure that it's not only true in Britain, but everywhere else, that that many people can name their local member of parliament or local legislator or here congressman. And a vastly fewer number of people have any idea who their Brussels representative is. Brussels tends to operate as a bureaucracy and not a legislature. And that tends to make its dictates appear undemocratic. In Britain and the United States, and in France as well, and any other country you want, when the national legislature passes a law, whatever it is, as long as the legislature is democratically elected, it's very difficult for people in the country to say, you know what, I don't like that law. People do it, but there's no sense that it's not legitimate. It was their representatives that passed it. With the EU, at least perception goes, that's a much lesser fact. So people do feel, certainly in Britain, that the EU regulations are non-consultative in the sense that they were not passed by anybody who had anything to do, or anyone has any political legitimacy from the British electorate. Okay, so we have the economic issues. We know of them. We understand them. Let's take one more look at that before we move on. Okay, so this is British, EU, and UK GDP. Britain probably has an advantage in growth rates, not a tremendous advantage in the period through here. And of course, you know, the most impact, what's going to have the most impact on a vote like this is going to be the recent economic history. Let's just assume it's since 2008. But through a good portion of this period here, from 2010 on, the British economy has been performing considerably better as far as growth rates go than its European counterparts, than the EMU. Now, this is not true, of course, if you look at individual countries. It's certainly not true of the comparison between Germany and Britain. And France and Britain compares reasonably well too. Italy, less so. So the EU as a whole is obviously not Germany. And on the whole, the British economic performance in the period of the last 6 or 7 years has been better. But this is one that is likely to cause, among the economic factors, more problems for those who want to stay in the European Union as far as a particular statistic goes. This, of course, is the unemployment rate comparing between the EU and Britain. And you have double on the continent. The United States is comparable to Britain, and the continent is a state of a different order. This is a very easy graph to understand. And part of the issues for those, as this referendum transpires, it's fascinating. It's only like, it's the end of March now. It's only 3 months for this referendum to take place. And this is, without question, a historic referendum because it will reverse something like 60 years or 70 years of European political direction with one vote. And a potentially, you know, the European unifiers, the people who support Britain staying, have to be concerned because most of the elections where the people, the electorate, are asked on the euro, they say no. And so that, as a recent example of the only type of approval sought from the electorate, has to make the unifiers concerned. This graph, all the other ones show you the tightness of the relationship between, as you'd expect, between Britain and the continent when it comes to economic trends, economic performance. This one will be able to be used dramatically, even if I can't vouch for the accuracy, but dramatically to address that congruence. Because as the difficulty for the people who support continued membership, rejection of Brexit, is that their arguments are far more convoluted. They are less, convoluted is a bad way to put it. They are less obvious, and they're certainly less emotionally elated than the arguments for departure. And this is one of those relatively emotional points that can be made for the people who would prefer to leave the Union. Okay. So on the, let's just look at one more here. Okay, this is a quarter to quarter. This is the, the year-on-year comparison for the GDP. So you can see the difference that can be, as with the unemployment chart, the difference that can be used by people who oppose continued membership in more simpler terms as to what will occur the longer Britain stays. And you can actually use this argument, this chart on GDP, by saying as the EU regulatory state begins to bite, and I can't vouch for whether or not how true this is, because I'm not following that closely how many more regulations coming out of Brussels over time, over say the past 5 years, have started to apply to Britain. If there's anyone in the audience who knows this, please let people know. I'm not sure whether that will be the case. But you can certainly see that there has been a narrowing of the gap in GDP year on year between the UK and the EMU, and it is both from a rise in the EU, but it's also, which is probably more worrying for the people who want to stay, a decline in British GDP. And I'm sure somebody will make the argument, well, that is due, at least partially, to the ever-rising imposition of regulations from the EU bureaucracy in Brussels. I do not, nor do I pass judgment on whether that's true or not, but it will undoubtedly be represented that way in the argument, in the public argument over the next 3 months on that topic. Okay. From the economic point of view, let's just find CB rates here. No, that's not a good one, sorry. Okay, let's do this one here. Okay. Come on, Google. Okay, there we go. So from an economic point of view, I think the argument is reasonably balanced. You can make a pretty good argument. You can make a very good argument that Britain needs to stay within the EU. You can also make a more emotional, but certainly more than acceptable argument that Britain will fare better economically, if not initially, from leaving the EU. And my guess is if those were the only conditions for making a decision by the electorate would vote to stay. That's my guess. It's my theory. There'll never be any proof of it, so I'm free to say that that's the case. However, those are not the only issues. And I think, and people, I'm sure you know where I'm going to have to go with this, as sometimes unpleasant as it is. The issues of sovereignty are going to be used and are far more emotional issues by the Brexit campaigners to make the case that that Britain will remain more British and safer if it leaves the EU. Now, the initial entrance of sovereignty is what I alluded to earlier. Who's making the rules that Britain has to obey? And it's not only rules, because Brussels has grand visions. It's not only rules about the economic interaction between the nations within the EU, but some of the pretensions of Brussels rule makers stray far from simply economic items. And I think when those types of issues are perceived culturally, it becomes a great issue. People are not inclined to change their beliefs and their ideas about how they relate to their own politics. Democracies have great political agreement because, to a greater degree than any other system, the people living under its rule feel that they have a say in those rules. When they don't, is when problems start. So what the answer to this, of course, and I think the answer that was envisioned by the people who planned and imagined the European Union was along the lines of, well, the national legislatures will perhaps lose some credibility, or at least some loyalty, and the supranational entity, the Brussels Parliament, would gain legitimacy, and the trade-off would go smoothly from one to the other. We are up against a very stubborn fact of human nature here. Things don't work that way, and they certainly haven't worked this way. And a project like this to take place within 2 generations is, I think, preposterous. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but the idea that everyone would suddenly become a European rather than an Englishman or a Frenchman or an Italian or a Pole or whatever you would like, is enormously naive. There's only been one nation that's ever been, well, not one nation, but very few nations have accomplished this type of loyalty in vision. I remember an example I can give for myself is that Trevisani, my grandparents were Italian, from the old country. And my father was fluent in Italian, yet Italian was never spoken in my household when I was growing up. And the reason was because my father and his parents came to the United States not to remain Italians in the United States, but to become Americans. And for them, the language was a hugely important symbol of their desire to become Americans. My grandfather never mind, that's not true. So that's the kind of issue, that's the way that it's been managed here in the United States. And I'm not drawing a comparison as good or bad here. I'm just saying that it's part of the culture here in the United States, and it's much more difficult than Europe. So the issue of Brussels is one. It's not a distant issue, I think, for the electorate, a large portion of the electorate in Europe, and certainly in England, which has sort of a distant relationship with the continent anyway. It is one which I think people feel much more deeply than you might imagine, that the imposition of rules from Brussels is one which is resented by people in the UK. So we have the sovereignty issue. And then, of course, we have a much more difficult issue, and that is the issue, and this is a relatively recent issue, but it is a highly emotional issue. It is the immigration of millions of people from the Middle East, for various reasons, to the EU. The EU, by and large, has a declining birth rate. I'm not on speaking terms, meaning I don't know Angela Merkel, but I'm sure that one of the reasons behind her determination to accept all of these refugees was to help alleviate that issue. Germany has a declining population. It's about to accelerate, as is true of Italy and many of the other social democratic welfare states of Europe. They're going to run out of people. They're not going to run out of retirees, not in the short term. This is the look around the world. And if you want examples of the difficulty this creates for economies, then you just look at Japan. But this also is an issue that people approach emotionally. And it is one, I think, which tells against Britain's continued membership in the EU. And the issue, of course, now Britain has actually exempted itself from the, I think it's surgeon protocols, in that they do not let people throughout. They didn't join that free travel zone, which is true on the continent. There are thousands and thousands, and the French are very annoyed about this. There are thousands and thousands of immigrants refugees from the Middle East in Calais, and they want to go to Britain, and Britain says you're not coming. And that is something which the Schengen area was supposed to do away with. So even though Britain is largely outside that particular issue, my guess is that if Britain, that the fears are that ability to withstand Brussels dictates will be eroded over the years if Britain votes to stay within the European Union. The last issue, of course, is probably the most difficult, and it is one which is, I'm not going to touch on too heavily, but just to note it because it must be noted, because I think it is part of the discussion. And that, of course, are the recent terrorist attacks going back for more than a number of years now. And then, this goes back a long way, because there was a terrible bombing on the Spanish metro, I believe, in about 10 years ago. That's bombing in Britain. And the very recent attacks, and the ones that are most important, of course, are the ones happening right now, because the vote is in 3 months. And these types of issues can be powerfully swayed by an attempt like that. I live in Manhattan, so and I've lived there for many, many years. So I am fully aware of the emotional weight that these kinds of events can have. The attack in Paris and the recent attack in Brussels will, and if there are any more between now and the vote, will have a particularly telling effect on the decisions that people will make. Okay, so now that we've covered what I hope we've covered anyway, some of the issues behind, let's talk about how this might possibly play out. And this is going to be a little more difficult because the part of it's going to have to be my opinion. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to deal with it if we can kind of imagine what will happen. There are substantial British politicians on both sides of this issue, substantial Tory politicians on both sides of this issue. Of course, David Cameron and much of his cabinet is in favor of remaining. He did not, as a negotiation, get a whole lot out of the EU that he could bring back to the people of Britain and say, these are the concessions, let's stay for the economy. They did not give a lot. My guess is that the Europeans have kind of run out of patience with everybody, at least the Germans and the French, who are wanting and who want to change the various systems that they've set up. On the departure side, there's, of course, Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, a very witty fellow and a great political presence in Britain. Great quotes out of him. I mean, he's a colorful guy to follow. He's very, very smart. And he is opposed to remaining within the EU. He's a supporter of Brexit. Now, you can make the argument that what will happen, of course, if Brexit goes through, if the British vote to leave, it will be almost impossible for David Cameron to remain in office as head of the Tory party. And the most likely replacement would be Boris Johnson. But that does not negate the legitimate arguments for leaving the European Union, nor does it negate the arguments for staying. But the point being that there are very notable figures. Also, the British Minister of Works and Pension, I believe is what it's called, Iain Duncan-Smith, resigned last week or the week before over departure, over Brexit. Traditionally, the Tory party has had a much larger component of Eurosceptics than the Labour Party, but the Labour Party got decimated at the last election. One further issue, which I don't think will actually impact as much the British electorate's decision, and that, of course, is Scotland. Labour took the biggest hit in the last election because all of the Scottish members voted for the Scottish National Party. They did not vote Labour, which they had been traditionally done. It seems quite positive. I mean, it seems to be Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the Independence Party, who is running the Scottish government, has said that if Britain votes to leave the EU, then there will be another vote on Scottish independence. The Scottish nationals want to remain within the EU. How much of an effect that will have on the British voter, I am in no way able to judge. But I think it will be far less than people imagine. My reasoning on that is that the emotion, because much of the argument at the time in Britain on the departure was that if the Scots really want to leave, then let them go. We shall see. So back to the assessment of where this goes. Latest polls have been pretty much tied. I think I saw one last week that had the Brexit supporters up by 2%. So at the moment, this is up in the air. What issues will affect this? The argument for staying is harder to prove than the argument for leaving. The argument for staying is less emotional than the argument for leaving. The view of the political leaders is less telling, I think, than the emotional aspects of this decision. Perhaps something which is uncontrollable, at least from our point of view, and unknowable, and could actually turn the election, certainly if it's a close one, is if there are other continental terrorist attacks in the next 3 months. I have no idea whether there will be or not. I don't know that anyone does. But a few more of those, and the security sovereignty issues, especially with the huge influx of refugees to the European Union, many of which have been stopped in their desire to immigrate to Britain, could in fact be a determining factor. This is, I don't know if it's something you'll tell your children about, perhaps the Europeans will. It is a hugely historic vote. If Britain stays, not so much. If Britain leaves, enormously. The separatist forces, and this is something that the Europeans have seen before, are funded by problems, economic and political. And as they rise, so does their strength. Okay, folks, I thank you very much for attending. I will put my email address up there. It's been an hour. If anyone has any comments or questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Just send them to me and I will send you an email back. Again, I thank everyone for attending. I take it as a great compliment that people take time out of their day to listen to what I have to say. And we will see you next Monday when we return to a currency topic. Thank you very much, folks, and everyone have a good day. All the good